Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the last session of the day. First of all, happy GIS Day to everybody. And I'd like to read a short introduction about our last speaker. And I believe he presented earlier. My name, by the way, is Divina, and I'm moderating this session for this afternoon. So our presenter for this afternoon is Michael Core. Michael Core is the application developer designer for the Florida Resources and Environmental Analysis Center at the Florida State University. He has an extensive knowledge of GIS, geography, geology, remote sensing, utility energy modeling, cadastral records, storm impact modeling, change detection, and land classification. His current research interests are directed towards quantifying Hurricane Michael's impacts using nighttime lights and vegetation density on Tallahassee, Florida, and also measuring the effects of long-term climate change and water hyacinth in El Salvador. Michael also has an extensive working knowledge on the ESRI products. You will see that later during his presentation, what has he been doing. And he's also looking to start at his PhD in geography at Florida State University soon. So just an overview of the general flow of this 2-hour session. The first and second part are 3-minute presentations by Michael, and then in between we'll have a 5-minute break, and then the third part would be a presentation of a story map, and then the last part is a Q&A. So we'll have Michael present all of these and with breaks in between, and then I'll be monitoring the chat or questions box to take note of the questions that we'll be dealing later. Michael, you can take over.
Thank you so much for that great introduction.
All right, let me just, you should be able to share your screen now.
Right. Can you see my screen?
I see.
Is there an email or is there a PowerPoint?
I see an email right now. Okay, I see your PowerPoint now.
Oh, goodness. How do I get to the other? Perfect. Sorry about that.
No worries.
All right.
Yeah, that's cool. Right. I can see the screen now, your PowerPoint.
All right. So we're going to give 2 talks today and then look at a story map that uses some of the data from the second talk. The first talk looks at Wakulla County wastewater site, where we were asked to identify some karst topography features on the wastewater site for a rapid infiltration basin wastewater site. This was done on behest of the Wakulla Springs Alliance with partnership with Dr. Julie Harrington. So karst topography is terrain with distinctive characteristics that indicate bedrock dissolution, usually limestone by the groundwater within an aquifer system. Specific karst features include sinkholes, sinking streams, swalettes, internally drained catchments, karst springs, relic springs, caves, and karst flow paths. Karst topography can be identified by mapping the distribution of sinkholes, caves, and springs, and examining the relationship between the features and other physical environment characteristics like water flow. Furthermore, some characteristics of karst topography make them susceptible to contamination. For instance, their proximity to the surface allows for rapid infiltration of contaminants, and they can be a vector for pathogens. So this is an infographic that I put together after doing the research. We did not put this on the internet. We didn't make a dashboard for this or its own website. It wasn't needed. Generally, we do take it to that next level. So we can look at a few things inside of here. For instance, to do this analysis, we took a look at several data sets, including flood zones. We calculated the topographic wetness. We looked at digital elevation models and slopes. We looked at the general geology and soil makeup of the area. We looked at the area over time. And then we also looked at the well depths and potential for water infiltration. So the proposed property location for the wastewater site is in south central Wakulla County, north of US 98 and west of Spring Creek Highway. Two major sinkholes have been observed on the property since 1994. It's in Township 60N, Range 60 East, Section 50. The tract size is approximately 100 acres. The depth to the water table is sufficient for recharge to the aquifer. The water table was encountered between 13 and 18 foot below the land surface when engineers did borehole testing. FDEP regulatory district is the Northwest District Water Management. So as well as the proposed wastewater site location is within the FEMA firm flood zone A and X. The Wakulla Springs property focus area, PFA, and Wakulla PFA2. The statewide basin management action plan, BMAP, general areas, Wakulla Springs project, and the total maximum daily load basin group was the Northwest District Group 1 for the St. Mark's group. So there were cave systems found nearby. Cave systems that were near the wastewater site include the Wakulla Springs cave system, which is 2.5 miles away, the Springs Creek cave system, which is 4 miles away, Shepherd Spring, 2.1 miles, and Lost Creek drainage cave system, which is about 1.5 miles away. Several water bodies were found within the site that are on the National Wetlands Inventory, including Springs Creek Drain, West Goose Creek, and then an unnamed slough. The soils found on the site include sorry about that. The soils found on the site include alpha soils, spotted soils, Aetna soils, and septosoils, and utilisoils. So this is the first map, which looks at geologic makeup. As we can see here, the map shows the wastewater site with a red rectangle outline. Furthermore, the Karst topography examples are marked with red circles. The site's underlying geology is limestone, marked with gray, and medium unconsolidated sand, silt, and clay with little organic material marked by pale yellow. Alternatively, the cave formations can be seen in pink. The National Wetlands Inventory water body features are highlighted in blue. Likewise, the reported subsidences are marked by a hollow yellow circle. Lastly, Shepherd Spring can be seen by an orange point mark. Limestone formations allow for conduits that connect points of infiltration with a karst aquifer. Medium fine sand and silt allows for drainage into the underlying water table. Cave systems are evidence of surrounding karst formations. The National Wetlands Inventory shows that there are groundwater exposures near the wastewater site. Reported subsidences, also known as sinkholes, are evidence of the underlying karst formations. And so we can see here is the wastewater site. Here is a swallet that was reported on the subsidence incident report. And we can see the caves and the spring systems and the National Wetland Inventory. Here's where a step of analysis takes place. This is called the Topographic Wetness Index, and this map looks at the Topographic Wetness Index as well as a digital elevation model, which you can see here in the blue in light blue boxes across the bottom are the steps that was taken to come up with the topographic wetness index. We've got the topographic wetness index is a steady state of wetness index. It is commonly used to quantify topographic control on hydrologic processes. It shows surface water flow and surface water catchments. So we start with a 30-meter DEM, digital elevation model. Then we compute flow direction using Esri's tools. Then we take the flow direction to compute flow accumulation, likewise using a geoprocessing tool. Then we use the DEM to calculate slope, again using a spatial analysis tool set. Then we go into the raster calculator using the slope. We convert it from degrees to radians. Then we take, also in the raster calculator, we come up with the slope tangent. And then we check the digital elevation model cell size just to make sure that it's still at the nearly 30-meter resolution. And in this case, it's at 27.9. Then we take the raster calculator and we take the flow accumulation and we scale it so it's easier to colorize. And then we take the raster calculator and we take the flow accumulation scaled and divide it with the slope tangent, and we get a wetness index. And this instant catchment areas can be seen by an increase in blue and dark blue hash marks seen in the northern Karst topography formation and the hourglass-shaped National Wetland Inventory water body that touches the center western border on the map. So here you can see the increase in catchments. And then also in this this water body feature, you can see the increase in catchments. And you can see that with the increase in dashed blue lines. So also, we have the topographic wetness index ranges from 1 to 9. The digital elevation model displays the elevation with low areas marked in light blue and higher elevations drawn in brownish red. The height of the site ranges from below 8 feet to above 20 feet. The contouring lines can also be seen in black. Areas with lower elevation are in light blue. The Karst topography formations on the wastewater site are lower than the surrounding land, and that helps to indicate the presence of a sinkhole. And we'll zoom in on that just one more time. Here we're looking at a digital elevation model and slope. The wastewater side is shown with the red rectangle again. The Karst topography examples are marked with red circles. The digital elevation model displays the areas with lower elevations that are closer to 0 in white. Like I said, the bottom line is around 8-foot elevation. The areas that are higher elevation, which are nearly 26 foot, are displayed with brighter reds. The peak of the wastewater site ranges, like I said, from about 8 to 20 foot. Alternatively, the slope is expressed in degrees, and the areas with steeper slope can be seen with the brown highlights surrounding topography changes like buildings, roads, water features, and subsidences. So for instance, over here we can see outlines of buildings. For instance, right here, this would be buildings, and you can see another building here. And then we can see the road beds from where the curves in the side of the road beds differ from the surrounding topography. And then coming into the waste, likewise with the water management site, we can see the inclination around the edges of the wastewater site going into a very smooth depression. Similarly, we can see that in the Karst topography features. So the inclination ranges from 1 degree to about 15 degrees. The area with the most inclination on the side is the smaller Karst topography, which is nearly 15 degrees. This digital elevation model came from the Northwest Florida Water Management District. It has about a 5-foot resolution. It was derived from LiDAR data. And in this example here, we can see that the flat area is in the center of the Karst topography also, just like we saw in the wastewater site, in the natural wetland water body over here. All right, so here we looked at the well depths and the FGS springs protected areas. The well depths were computed using the actual well depth information from FGS. So the map shows the wastewater sites in the red rectangle outline. The FGS springs areas are seen in purple. The reported subsidences are displayed in a hollow yellow circle. Likewise, the well locations can be seen in green points, and the well depths are noted next to each site. The swallets, also known as sinking streams, display a solid filled red circle with a tail. You can see the county boundary in black. The inverse distant weighting estimate surface attempts to measure the groundwater level based on well depths. The inverse distant weighting estimation surface for the well depths can be seen ranging from blue for wells as high as 40 foot to red for wells as deep as 220 foot. The wastewater site is estimated to have a well depth of 80 foot. Or in the lowest range of well depths from the calculation. This is helped to be backed up by the borehole findings from the engineers, which showed that the well depth was around 18 or 20 foot. Here is taking a look at the FEMA firm and the elevations. Again, we see our site here in the red outline. The contours are in white. And here I decided to go ahead and highlight the water body. This is the water body that we've been comparing our wastewater site Karst topography to. The site is in a FEMA firm flood zone for the 2% annual chance hazard, and for the zone A. A large portion of the wastewater site in the 100-year flood zone could potentially have overspill contamination into the surrounding water bodies and underlying water table if and when the 100-year flood occurs. Here is a picture of each individual historical aerial. So this is back in 1994. We can see the formations here, as well as we can see that this was once used for agriculture, tree farming. You can see that each site was not planted with agriculture trees. We can see that in 1999, the site was still used for ag, and the Karst topography features are still too wet or have too much inclination to be planted. Now coming down to 2014, we can see that the agriculture use has been alleviated from the area, but the Karst topography presence is still there. And then again, in 2018, we can look and we can see the dark impressions still on the aerial, just using visual inspections. So let's see. The growth of the trees in the 1994 aerial would indicate that the Karst topography formations would predate the timber farm, and would mean that the formations have been there at least since the 1980s. So in conclusion, Karst topography features our underground caves and water systems that can connect to our drinking water aquifers. They can be identified based on formations such as caves, sinking streams, elevation depressions. These types of land features can allow contaminants and pollutions to flow into the drinking water aquifers. The wastewater site has evidence of 2 significant depressions that have been on the site since about at least the 1980s that I could tell from my research. We used aerial photography, contour elevations, digital elevation models, slope, and topographic wetness to identify the sites. And that's about it for this. So what we're going to do next is take a break for about 5 minutes, and then we're going to start on the next presentation. Does anyone have any questions about what we just covered?
I think there's one question here, but would you, all right, let me see. I'm trying to open it.
We can wait till the end.
Yeah, the end. So we can have like the 5-minute break. So it's 3:22 right now. So we'll resume at 3:27. 5-minute break.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. All right. It's 3:27. Michael, are you ready to resume your presentation?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. All right. Take it away.
All right. Thanks for coming back, everyone. The second part is going to be looking at sea level rise impact projections for Wakulla County. This was done with William Strode and myself. So to begin, sea level rise related to climate change poses problems globally, resulting in frequent flooding, storm surge, economic losses, land inundation, reduced biodiversity, and forced migration. Sea level rise can begin with nuisance flooding and saltwater intrusions and end with permanent land loss. Florida has about 1,350 miles of coastline, which is only second to Alaska, and is particularly vulnerable to sea level rise. The study analysis on sea level rise scenarios can affect property and social vulnerable populations in Wakulla County for the year 2050. We kind of focus on permanent inundation. We don't focus on the ramp up state. Findings show that properties affected total $200 to $300 million loss in today's dollars, with many structures being residential homes. Social vulnerability analysis shows no disparity between county residents versus living within areas at risk of permanent inundation for themes of socioeconomic, household, disability, and ethnicity and language. Which is different for the transportation, but we'll discuss that. However, half of the vulnerability for housing and transportation lies within the county versus in coastal areas. The study has the potential to serve as a framework for other counties to estimate sea level risk. So sea level has undergone significant shifts over the past several million years, at times being higher than what our seas are now. These shifts has caused substantial changes in shorelines positions. We've been really lucky though, for about 6,000 years, they've been pretty stable. Unfortunately, the current projections are showing that we're time for change. It's showing that future sea level rise rates could become more like historical deglaciation periods. So a lot of our sea ice was locked up in land ice during the Pleistocene, and now that that's been over with for a long time, we have to deal with what's going to happen next. Currently, the primary causes of sea level rise ice are ice loss and thermal increase of the sea, both driven by climate warming. Global mean sea levels rise was about 1.7 millimeters a year through the 20th century. Now we've seen an increase by about 0.01 millimeters a year. So from the 1950s to the year 2000, the lowest sea level rise rates were in the 1980s, and the highest sea level rise rates were in the 1990s, ironically. Between 1993 and 2014, satellite data was combined with other data to determine that there has been a 2.2 millimeter a year global sea level rise between 1993 and 2014. It is expected that sea level rise will further accelerate over the next century, eclipsing the fast rates of global sea level rise that we have seen through 1993 to 2014. The map here shows the 3 sea level rise scenarios that we're going to compute, which are low, middle, and high, basically. Sea level rise is a threat to coastal communities. and properties and the people who live and work in those areas. Over time, it's expected that sea level will not only cause transient flooding, it's also associated with those burst effects in many coastal areas that will cause permanent land loss. Despite this, coastal properties are generally densely populated, and these communities are often major economic producers, housing a disproportionate number of jobs, economic output, and trade entry points. The reality of coastal communities having high population densities and economic dominance is not expected to change anytime soon. Understanding when permanent inundation will occur, to what extent it will happen, and who it will affect, and the financial impacts caused by the sea level rise are essential to local and federal governments for future community planning. So sea level rise can cause many adverse effects, including saltwater intrusion, erosion, and inundation. However, sea level rise does not affect all areas equally, instead of having the most pronounced effect on low-lying coastal areas. Over the next century, these low-lying areas are likely to experience flooding, erosion, and land submersion. Here in the map, we can see that the lower lying areas near the coast and the Gulf of Mexico are the ones that are going to be affected by the sea level rise. So what's at risk? So Florida has a lot of coastlines. Significant sea level rise will cause a substantial number of people to be at risk of having their properties damaged or destroyed, as well as their sources of income ended, or they will have to relocate inland or to non-affected areas. Depending on the demographic of the populations at risk being affected by sea level rise, the ability of these populations to respond to the threats posed by the effects of the sea level rise may pose significant challenges. Florida is a significant tourism draw, with over 106 million tourists visiting in 2015 alone. The economic impact that drives many jobs and billions of dollars of revenue for the state is tourism. Many visit Florida's beaches, which account for 825 miles of Florida's coastline and receive more than 810 million visitors per year. Florida's coastline has evidence important for the state's interest. So there are many ways to analyze sea level rise. Common ones are tide gauges. That's the most common data input. Local past sea level values and LIDAR data are the second most common inputs, followed by greenhouse gas emissions, air temperature, subsidence, land elevation, and global sea level values. Less common inputs are hydrography, precipitation, glacier and ice loss, and tropical storms. The subject matter of these studies are varied. Several assesses past and future sea level rise values. Others examine coastal forest loss, saltwater intrusion, social vulnerability, vulnerable populations, real estate losses, mortgages, and home price vulnerability. Tide gauges were used consistently across 30 years of sea level rise study. LIDAR data appears much later and is used in more recent studies. So in 2020, the Florida legislation passed a bipartisan statute to address new coastal construction for 2021. The Florida statute 161.551 was passed to require new coastal construction projects using public funds to undergo a sea level impact projection model analysis before construction can begin. The FDEP has the Florida Resilient Coastline Program, is responsible for approving the model and publishing them. The original intent of our study was to demonstrate the FDEP's methodology to interpret and implement Florida Statute 161.551. Unfortunately, the FDEP had not completed the rules and methods at the time that this project took place. Furthermore, the FDEP's plan was designed to protect Florida infrastructure, invest for a single construction project and not designed for a large geographic area. So their tool only looks at one point and calculates your score based on their metric for one point location and not for like the county level or neighborhood level. Since we could not use the FDP's methodology, we concluded that we wanted to perform a county-wide analysis in hopes that our work would complement FDEP's methods. Rule 62S-7 of Florida Statute 161.551 requires state finance coastal construction projects to complete the sea level impact projection studies. You do not have to use their tool, but it is recommended because it saves a lot of time and money. So these studies are to evaluate the potential storm or sea level rise impacts on construction in the Florida coastline. So the SLIP tool study standards set out by the statute requires analysis of sea level rise for 50 years into the future or for the life of the construction project, whichever time is less. Analysis of the sea level rise must include the intermediate high sea level rise scenario from NOAA. The analysis must also use interpolated local sea level rise using the two closest NOAA coastal tide gauges to the project site. Flood depth must be calculated using a minimum in the North American Vertical Datum, NAVD 88, for intermediate high sea level rise. Land subsidence must be included in the study as calculated by NOAA. This is done using local tide gauges and automatically included in the NOAA sea level rise projections. The standards also require analysis of flooding, wave action, and inundation for 50 years into the future or for the life of the project. And there are 3 rules that are included on how we do this. First, the NAVD 88 must be used to approximate FEMA storm surge flood depths for a 100-year flood scenario. Second, the flood depth must be used with the intermediate high flood scenario defined by NOAA to assess flood risk using critical elevation points. Third, the vertical construction only, the cost of future flood damage must be estimated using depth change curves from 2015 North Atlantic Coast Comprehensive Study. The project must also receive a risk category as defined by the 2020 Florida Building Code Table 1064.5 risk category buildings and other structures. You also need wind speed designations, which is determined by risk categories as mentioned above. And then alternative project designs and site locations must also be submitted. The tool will give you different best management practices and will also rate your project once you're done putting in the data that it requires. So for this study, we performed a sea level rise impact projection for Wakulla County, Florida for the year 2050 to determine areas of permanent inundation. We use low, intermediate, and high scenarios shown by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers sea level change curve calculator to determine sea level rise. The areas of permanent inundation are used to calculate the value of the damage done to property. Parcel social vulnerability characteristics, as calculated by the CDC, are also used to count who is at risk and compare Wakulla County's population to the portion of the county at risk under the high scenario. So here we can see Wakulla County, Florida is located 30 miles south of Tallahassee. The county is minimally developed and contains portions of Apalachicola National Forest and St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge. The shorelines are mostly marshy, only having 4 small sand beaches, which stretch 3 miles in total. The county is best known for being the home of Wakulla Springs State Park and the landmark lighthouse at St. Mark's. The 2010 census at the time of this project found that Wakulla County is home to 30,776 people. Table 1 shows population projections from the Bureau of Economic and Business Research and the Florida Department of Transportation expect the population to increase by 35.82% over the next 40 years. So we used a similar approach to WARI for this exercise to calculate sea level rise for Wakulla County. So we needed 3 data sets, basically. The first data set that we needed was the NOAA sea level rise data digital elevation models, DIMS. The digital elevation models required for this project were the 2012 NOAA Coastal Service Center inundation DEMs for mobile Tallahassee, AL, FL, WFO, A1, AL, FL, WFO, A2, and then AL, FL, WFO, A3, which all cover different areas of county. So the 3 A1, A2, and A3 DIMs were available via the NOAA Sea Level Rise data download portal. The DIMs were in a 5-meter resolution, referenced vertically to NADV 88 in meters and horizontally to NAD 83. The DIMs were derived from LiDAR data that was assumed to have a 1-meter horizontal accuracy. The DIM values were in 32-bit floating point raster TIFF format. Lastly, the data for the DIMs were collected in 2007. The digital elevation models were used to generate the elevation values from which each inundation class was derived. The second data sets that were needed were the NOAA Office for Coastal Management Sea Level Rise data features current mean high water inundation extent, which is the MHWIE. The current mean high water inundation extent data was available for download from the NOAA Sea Level Rise data portal. The MHWIE data was in a geodatabase format with feature classes that represent water inundation in feet. The data ranges from 0 to 10-foot inundation. The feature class data utilized the NAD 83 and NADV 88 that was updated in 2016. The 0-foot MHWIE feature class for TLH1, 2, and 3 were utilized to fill no data gaps and missing 0-foot data from the digital elevation models. The last data set was needed to determine the classes for categories for sea level rise inundation for 2050. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, U.S. ACE, ACE, Sea Level Rise Change Curve Calculator version 2021.12, estimated relative sea level change projections for gauge 8728690 Appalachia, Cola, Florida for the US ACE 2013 scenario were used to set the inundation classes. The 2015 values were 0.41 foot for low, 0.71 foot for intermediate, and 1.66 foot for the high category of sea level rise estimate. These 3 categories were used to classify the values derived from the merged digital elevation models and mean high water inundation extent data sets. So to do all this merging and data processing and everything, we use ArcGIS Pro version 2.8.1, and we also needed the spatial analyst extension. So the DIMs were added to a project document in Pro. They were inspected visually and the histograms were inspected. This was good because it revealed the no data values, which needed to be set to -9999. All the DIMs had some areas of no data. The no data areas need to be fixed later using the MHWIE 0-foot elevation values. No data values for the DIMs, as I said, were set to -9999 and subsequent raster processing to remove these erroneous areas from the analysis. Next, the ALFL, A1, A2, and A3 data sets were processed using the raster calculator and spatial analysis. The first calculation was to multiply each raster cell by 1,000. Then each raster cell was converted to an integer. Afterwards, each raster cell was converted to a polygon using the raster to polygon conversion tool. Next, the ALFL A1, ALFL A2, and ALFL A3 data sets were processed using the raster calculator and the spatial analysis extension. The first calculation was to multiply each cell by 1,000, then each cell was, sorry about that, let me just cover that. So in the newly created ALFL A1, A2, A3 polygon feature classes, the fields were added to the attribute table of the layers for calculations using the calculate field data management tool. The first calculation was to convert the grid code back to its original value by dividing the values by 1,000. Next, each value was converted from meters to feet by multiplying by 3.28084. Finally, the last calculation field operation was used for classifying the USACE inundation classes, low, intermediate, and high scenarios into the digital elevation derived code feet values. So we needed a string text field. So here we can see the methodology. All NOAA-DIMS derived feature class now have the USACE low, intermediate, or high classification. We dissolve based on the USACE classification field, and then we use the merge geoprocessing tool to take the TLH1, 2, and 3 mean high watermark inundation extent 0 foot with the ALFL 1, 2, and 3 inundation classes. All right, so now that we know our extent of our sea level rise and we have our 3 inundation classes, we can start looking at other variables to put with that. So here we're going to look at population analysis on the 3 sea level rise scenarios for the year 2050. Begin by determining where people live. Typically, population estimates are at the census tract scale, which assumes that population is evenly spread over an area when folks tend to be clustered. A census tract approach to population mapping could display people in unpopulated areas such as forests and water bodies. We used high resolution 1 kilometer grids from the Florida, from FREAC. The grids are a part of the Sartopo high resolution population data sets for search and rescue missions. The U.S. National Grid 1 kilometer 2020 population estimate data were processed utilizing WorldPop constrained 100-meter persons per pixel population counts for the United States, and then they can be downloaded from worldpop.org. The USNG 1 kilometer grid data is accessible by the usngcenter.org, and the USNG 1 kilometer grid and WorldPop 2020 population data sets were processed by FREAC, and they are available if you need them. Just let us know. Also, the GitHub that contains the Python script that will process the world population data into the U.S. National Grid is available if you're interested. The population count results were joined to the USNG 1 kilometer shapefile to combine the population count attributes to the U.S. National Grid. All right, now to further assess the population affected by sea level rise, we include social vulnerability index data for the Center of Disease Control and Prevention. The social vulnerability data are calculated using 15 data variables from the U.S. Census at the census tract scale. Each variability is statistically processed and ranked across all other tracts within Florida on a scale of 1 to 99. Each tract is assigned a score indicating its level of vulnerability. For example, a score of 0.23 shows that a tract is more vulnerable than 23% of the tracts in Florida, meaning low vulnerability. A parcel with a vulnerability score of 0.9 would be more vulnerable than 90% of the census tracts in Florida, which indicate high vulnerability. The CDC uses a quartile method to distinguish vulnerabilities with breakpoints at 0.25, 0.5, and 0.75 to determine the four categories. The social vulnerability data includes 5 indices. One is an overall indice that considers all 15 data variables, and then the other 4 are theme indices, including assessments of census subsets to represent different types of vulnerability. These include the socioeconomic vulnerability, has income and education, household and disability, looks at the ratio of children and elders in a household, as well as disabilities. Ethnicity and language considers ethnic diversity and English skills. Housing and transportation includes measures of apartments, mobile homes, and access to transportation. This study uses the 4 social vulnerability themes to distinguish the types of public risk. To avoid using 4 separate maps or 4 separate map layers, we chose to use the social vulnerability glyph mapping technique developed by Dr. Strode, where 4 themes can be mapped simultaneously. The glyphs use colors and placement to indicate the type of vulnerability and glyph size to show the degree of vulnerability. For example, socioeconomic themes is shown in red and would be in the upper right corner. The size of the socioeconomic symbology indicates the degree of the vulnerability. So in our study, it showed that it showed that Wakulla County has a relatively high vulnerability compared to other areas in Florida. The southern side of the city of Crawfordville has a somewhat high vulnerable for household disability and low socioeconomic vulnerability, as evidenced in the study. The town of St. Mark's has a higher socioeconomic and housing and transportation vulnerability. The county has low ethnicity and language vulnerability overall. So in this map, we can see the vulnerability glyphs. As you can see, the red there shows the socioeconomic vulnerability, and the smallest size grid squares that we can see in the glyphs would be the 25% indicator, and then when you have the next size up, that's at 50%, and then you have the largest size 75%, and then the full-on fill there. This study seeks to determine if sea level rise affects vulnerable persons equally across the county. To do this, we compare the percent of vulnerable populations in the county to the percent of vulnerable populations within the high scenario sea level rise area. So we considered vulnerability populations those in the top 50% with vulnerability scores of 0.50 or higher, representing the most vulnerable groups. The land parcel inundation data and the 1 kilometer gridded population data were used to determine which populations within the county intersected with the social vulnerability data. So the land parcel data was obtained from the Wakulla County Property Appraiser's Office. This data contains not only geometries for Wakulla County's land parcels, but it also includes valuation information and land use classifications. Each of the 3 sea level rise scenarios was used to determine where permanent inundation intersected with land parcels. The affected parcels from the property appraiser database for each sea level rise scenario were then used to determine the sum of their just values, the land use categories for parcels, and the sum of their just values for each land use type. So sea level rise projections for the year 2050 using the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers sea level change curve calculator for low, intermediate, and high scenarios have allowed us to create estimates for property value loss due to any permanent inundation of land parcels. We were also able to estimate the number of people affected under each scenario using the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index to examine who is involved. Under all three sea level rise projections, our results show permanent inundation affecting many land parcels. Any land parcel that experienced permanent inundation of any size and is considered involved to the calculation and is calculated the just value of the properties as damage. Under the low scenario, the total just value of land parcels experienced permanent inundation is about $200 million. Under the intermediate, we've got about $234 million, and under the high scenario, we're over $300 million. No matter which scenario is considered, the most vulnerable category of land parcel is residential, totaling $85 million, $107 million, and $508 million respectively for each of the three projection levels. The second highest valued category of land parcels affected is governmental. The land parcel values for governmental is $79 million, $82 million, and $95 million for the high scenario. The third highest valued category of land affected is agriculture. All remaining land categories under all scenarios total less than $10 million each, with industrial having the highest just valued, followed by commercial, then non-agriculture acreage. And last is miscellaneous land type. This data shows that sea level rise over the next 3 decades will cause inundation of property parcels totaling significant values under all three scenarios, with the highest scenario being an approximate 50% increase in value over the low scenario. These increases are due to the permanent inundation affecting a more significant number of land parcels. Under the low scenario, 984 properties are involved. The intermediate, 1,236 parcels are affected, and then under the high scenario, 1,783 parcels are impacted. Of the 4 social vulnerability index measured by the study, socioeconomic, household and disability, ethnicity, and language are the same or almost the same between those living within areas which experience permanent inundation under the high sea level rise scenario and those throughout Wakulla County as a whole. This is seen on the left is the high inundation, and then the column on the right is Wakulla County as a whole. Housing and transportation vulnerability is the only category of the 4 that is significantly different. There is a significant difference between those living in areas at risk of permanent inundation under the high sea level rise scenario and those in Wakulla County as a whole. The numbers suggest that those living near the coast, the areas most susceptible to permanent inundation due to sea level rise, have lower housing and transportation vulnerability than those living inside the county. So in conclusion, the study analyzes how a sea level rise scenario can affect property and social vulnerability populations in Wakulla County in 2050. We applied land parcel population counts, social vulnerability analysis to project sea level rise inundation for Wakulla County. Our sea level rise projection include low, medium, and high projection through 2050. Projected population is to increase by 35.8% by 2050. The land parcels affected by inundation is going to be between $200 and $300 million in today's dollars, not accounted or adjusted for inflation. Most social vulnerability themes have even spatial distribution across the county, both inland and within the risk areas, except for housing and transportation, where the coastal areas have half of the vulnerability as the inland areas. This finding of the differences in housing and transportation vulnerability between inland and coastal areas is congruent with other studies, for instance, by Wang in 2012. The original intent of the study was to demonstrate that the Florida Department of Environmental Protection methodology from their new SLIP tool, but unfortunately we couldn't do exactly that because their tool wasn't finalized when we were doing the study, as well as we wanted to have a wider swath or breadth that we looked at versus just one point location. However, we were able to use the DEP's methodology as a rough guideline. We learned that the purpose of the DEP's guideline was primarily to protect the state's financial investment and only applied to single construction sites. DEP's methodology would inform planners of any risk to the property during the structure's life or 50 years. Having the knowledge can notify developers of foreseeable issues that could cause financial loss to the state. This study has an extent that is both broader and narrower than what has been laid out by the FDP's methodology. The study uses fewer data points to just demonstrate the projections for 2050, but it also has more encompassing perspective. It shows the sea level rise for all of Wakulla County using 3 scenarios. Further, we overlay property parcels and social vulnerability with sea level rise. Our results are helpful in several ways. The maps can raise awareness of the dangers of sea level rise using visual demonstrations. Planners and developers can use the provided information for locating project sites. The social vulnerability information can assist planners in allocating local resources according to vulnerable types and population densities. Our research is limited because it only assesses permanent inundation, the final phase of sea level rise, and does not consider the stages of sea level rise advancement that occur chronologically before inundation. These stages can include nuisance flooding, storm frequencies, subsidences, and other factors that can cause forced migration, saltwater intrusions, property devaluation, and job loss. Our research is further limited by the choice of land parcel and social vulnerability analysis. A broad study could include infrastructure assessment, including transportation, sewage, stormwater drainage, and pollutant impacts. Further investigation into economic effects such as employment and tourism would be beneficial. Additionally, it could be helpful to rerun this project with 2020 census data, since it's now available. Our research advances analysis through the use of fine-grained population and social vulnerability mapping. Our 1 kilometer gridded population data improves census tract population mapping by providing a clear view of residential areas and social vulnerability measures. Evaluating multiple social vulnerability themes instead of a singular index allowed a variation in the housing and transportation category to be seen. We hope that our research further interest in fine-grained assessment to reveal data patterns that might otherwise be masked. The information we present here is a public conservation on the importance of integrating climate models with social needs. We hope to contribute knowledge to empower local governments and lead to policy solutions for mitigating sea level rise. So now I guess we can take another break and then do the story map demo.
Yeah, maybe we get another 5-minute break. We'll come back at 4:10, and that's give you time to drink water and relax your vocal cords for the final presentation, and for our attendees to, get up and stretch a little bit. I know this is like a 2-hour session, and we appreciate you staying in. So let's come back 4:10.
Perfect, thank you.
All right. All right, welcome back to this lab session with the title A Sea Level Rise Impact Projection Study for Wakulla County. Our presenter, Michael Core. Michael will be presenting the third part of the whole session, which is a story map about resilient infrastructure. Michael, take it away.
Perfect, thank you. All right, last part of the session, and that'll be it for today. So all this, it's like a so what. We did a lot of analysis, and we've shown you several things, more than several things, between the two presentations that we gave. So this is what we're planning on doing next with all of this, well, at least with some of the analysis and the information that we've done. We've put together a little demo of the kind of the middle ground. We hope to help build resilient infrastructure for a net zero Florida panhandle through asset management and capital upgrades. We would like to be able to rank assets and buildings based on their greenhouse gas emissions and energy use, as well as their age of the building and quality of the materials that's made, and compare that with other metrics such as critical infrastructure, population, social vulnerability. And then we'd also like to be able to put that information into Bayesian networks to be able to compute posterior probabilities for the relationships amongst these variables. So potentially we could start to predict more and be more proactive in our decision making. So this is in hope how we're going to do that. All right, so the Resilient Infrastructure Team is an interdisciplinary team at FSU. It combines geographers, developers, engineers, poli-sci majors to kind of come together and help Florida communities and developers and planners to make better decisions. So what I'm going to do is just put this on autoplay, and then I'm going to stop to interact with some of the maps. And then I'll talk over it as it's going. So what kind of is the backbone of this is Hurricane Michael and the destruction left by Hurricane Michael. We can kind of see the chinks in our armor, if you will, when a major event like this occurs, as well as the duration of recovery time afterwards. We would like to be able to reduce the recovery time, increase the number of resilient construction that can survive major catastrophes, and learn how to move forward together better. The human impact to storms and climate change is insurmountable. It's something that we all have to face living in Florida one way or another. And unfortunately, whenever we have to make these decisions, you know, it's usually done in haste with little to no information available, and everyone just does the best that they can. So here's some Hurricane Michael before and afters. This was very popular right after Hurricane Michael. It was made very public, this little swipe map, but in case you haven't seen it, they had this up and running just a few days after Hurricane Michael hit. It was very useful, and very useful for giving information to the public. But we can get a very clear picture of the before and after. Well, maybe not right there. But anywho. Now, if you're already buying to the Esri domain and have access to ArcGIS online, even if it's just a free account, you can make a version of these story maps and you can include your data. It's really very similar to developing a website using blocks. So if you know about JavaScript and HTML, you can do this on your own without using story maps. But if you don't, it is a fairly intuitive system that allows you to just drag and drop blocks that represent different type of content and make it accessible. So some of the solutions that people are using now to be proactive are called living shorelines, and that's where they take materials and that are inspired by nature to rebuild our shorelines and make them resilient. It's very popular right now, and it seems like a very good effort to change the way that we do things. So now we're getting into infrastructure, and this is kind of where our data comes into light. So we hope to be able to combine more data sets to give people a better view. Like we want to focus on our infrastructure that relates to CO2 emissions, like our power plants, and be able to rate those. We would like to understand critical infrastructures and its relationship with our communities after major storm events and in the wake of climate change. So like hospitals and electric substations. For instance, an important finding that we found in our study for Hurricane Michael was that properties in close proximity to electric substations are likely to experience less power outages during a significant storm event. We would like to analyze those locations to understand why and potentially make more locations more resilient in the wake of these devastating storms. Other things that are important to consider are transmission lines, where they go, how to replace them, their value, as well as roads. Roads are very important. Not only do they have value that's seldom considered when we're looking at projections like sea level rise, furthermore, they have value because they are our evacuation routes to safety during these major storm events. People need dynamic ways to access the evacuation information that changes in real time to show routes that are inundated by flooding, down trees and power lines. We need to come up with innovative solutions to either come up with the probabilities of which areas are inundated or to actually sense and see those areas and make a determination. Infrastructure is not the only important part that we have to consider when we're planning to be resilient. We also need to understand what our communities look like. What are the community makeups? Where do those people live? Where do they work? So here we can see Tallahassee. And we can also see our populations. These data sets have already been processed for the entire state also. So everything that you see here, we already have done for the entire state of Florida. If you're interested in any of it or would like to discuss. So here's some of the information from the Wakulla Springs analysis, but we just went ahead and just did a broad current high water 1 foot and 2 foot. Most of the 2050 to 2070 ranges were within those convenient markings. And then we can also see the parcels affected. But we can see this for the entire state of Florida now. So, you know, we're trying to get the idea of the bigger picture, what we can do. We need to get a hold of our stakeholders and, you know, help give the communities a chance to make the choices for themselves. Definitely involving the people who are the experts in the community is one of the #1 priorities. So reasons why this is important. Population in Florida is increasing. By 2070, we're supposed to have 33 million people in Florida. So this is a baseline of land use by development and water use for 2010. This came from the Florida 2070 project. With their project, both of those features were in separate map layers, and you would have to go between the land development and water use. Here, it's in a bivariant symbology where you can see both land development and water use at the same time. So we can see that the way things are trending, and that developable land is decreasing. We can also see that the demands on water are increasing as our population is increasing. So here we can see the same area. This is the trend land use and water use for Pensacola. But there is hope. We do have alternative solutions. If we plan wisely, we can help diminish some of this water use and land development compactness, but we have to start making proactive decisions now. So here's another shot. This is directly from the 2070 project, just showing the different land development scenarios. So we'd like to try to potentially get stakeholders at a federal, state, and regional level. Potentially there's many people who have stake in the game for this. And there's many type of decisions that need to be made. Convening those stakeholders will help us narrow down the data sets and allow us to weight data sets based on importance using that expert opinion. We're geographers and statisticians and programmers. Unfortunately, we're not policymakers or politicians. We don't necessarily know the best route or specifically what the constituents are looking for. So identifying leaders in the community and people who really have their ear to the ground helps make our projects more potent, helps us to be able to deliver a much more usable tool to the community. This is just continuing through some of the stakeholders that are we're potentially going to reach out to that we have contacts with. And here's our team. This is the interdisciplinary team that I was referring to. This is who's going to be working on the project. And then, of course, the FREAC group will be giving their support, just as we always work together. So basically right now, the link down here to the bottom is to Ryder's Facebook page. You're more than welcome to take a look at that. Very soon, as soon as the group email address is filled out, there'll also be a form down here at the bottom. These story maps were made with some simple instruction. Let me pull it up real quick. So if you go here, like I said, if you have access to the Esri products, you can build a story map like that. If you don't have access to ArcGIS Online, you can create a free account and you can create a much more dialed back story map. If you know HTML, JavaScript, CSS, D3, and Leaflet, you can build one of those on your own with none of Esri stuff, and it'll be just as good or better. So the tools to build this story map are basically right here in this lesson, building a winning story map with ArcGIS story maps. If you just follow these 4 lessons, basically I had never built a story map before. I followed these 4 lessons and then I built that story map. It's pretty intuitive. So that's about it.
All right, thank you so much, Michael, and thanks to our participants, attendees who stayed in. I got 3 questions here, but before I read those questions, allow me to thank our sponsors for this Shrug GIS 2021 workshop. Thanks to Tallahassee Leon County GIS, thanks to Florida Resources and Environmental Analysis Center, Panda Consulting, Esri, Tallahassee Community College, and Dewberry. Thanks to our sponsors. And the first question is from Tony Cooper. He asked, are there plans to do a study like this for other coastal counties in the area like Franklin and Jefferson?
Yeah, the next iteration, we're hoping to be able to integrate basically my Bayesian network study and hurricane impact analysis with resilient infrastructure that was in the story map, as well as touching on the sea level rise and the impacts to land evaluation and infrastructure evaluation. The next step is doing that for the entire state as outlined in the story map. Each of those data sets shown in the story map is either already available from FGDL for the entire state, or we have already processed it, like the social vulnerability index or the high resolution population indexes. We've already got that processed for the entire state. So yes, we're just going to get evaluations, try to make our study more potent, refine our information, and then take it to a state level.
All right, we have another question, actually 2 questions from the same person, but he's not here anymore. The first question is related to your first presentation. He asked, these are long, what kind of WW structures are proposed for the site? Is it a facility or a deep well injection area?
It's
Wastewater.
A rapid infiltration basin site. It was basically, it wasn't a wastewater site. It was a site for water that had already been treated.
And his next question is related to your second presentation. This, he said, these are long forecast scenarios. Would these models be revised each year to understand variability and adjust for no change patterns?
So he's saying that 2050 is a long projection period.
I'm not sure which one he's referring to, but yeah, this is your second presentation about you were sharing forecast.
Right. You know, the models could be updated when we have new population data and vulnerability indexes information, as well as new U.S. Army engineer, as new U.S. Army Corps of Engineer curve information comes out. They could be recalculated, but a lot of the data, a lot of the analysis is dependent on other regulatory agencies. So we do have a community surveyor here in our office that does survey individuals in the community to get their responses to specific questions, but we don't generally go out and boots on the ground collect this data ourselves. We would update our data sets pending on the either federal or state level update schedule.
That's the last question. Any more questions from the attendees? Feel free to write it on the questions box. Okay, 3, all right. Still waiting for questions or comments. I must have missed this information. How many years was this research, Michael?
What do you mean?
The one you just presented, how many years did it take to, do the data collection, processing, and the analysis?
It took us about 2 months.
Oh, just 2 months. All right, that fast. That's yeah. As
I
long as
made that
data.
story map. I started that story map and made that story map in about 2 weeks. Some of the data we had already, some of it I had to process and make myself because we had the ideas put forth, but we didn't have the data specifically processed for state level.
Okay. Oh, there's another question from Tony Cooper. I missed this. Sorry, Tony. He says, thank you for doing this. Was the bipartisan legislation you were talking about earlier the bill that founded Resilient Florida?
It was the 161.551. It was just the bill that goes into the creation of the FDEP slip tool that pretty much required all coastal projects needed the sea level projections added to them for 50 years for the life of the project. Really, that was the inspiration.
Right. Let's see. Let me just double check the chat box. That was our last question.
Yeah, those are good questions. Definitely updating the data sets. I mean, a lot of times you don't necessarily think about updating projections out to 2050, but every few years, the Army Corps of Engineers or someone comes out with a new calculation curve or some new points to calculate off of, or they change a datum or something.
So these results, was this like recently presented or shared with Wakulla County or the community? I'm interested what their initial reaction or initial reaction after hearing the results, especially the projection. Do you have any?
Actually, as far as I know, I have not reached out to give anybody this information, and
Okay.
I haven't spoken with Julie Harrington either. Usually, she's our lead for Wakulla County. I can ask her if she's done anything with it, but that is a good question. I have not been so busy, I didn't stop to think about that.
That's yeah, I mean, it's just interesting, what would be like, we presented after presenting the research, then what would be their, solutions to mitigate, or what are the, I'm biased with nature-based solutions. What could be the nature-based solutions they could do to mitigate the projections, especially the sea level rise? How do we better prepare for that?
Yeah, those living shorelines are one of the #1 solutions that people are coming up with that's resilient and sustainable. And they've been using them all up and down the eastern shoreboard.
Okay. It looks like there's no other questions from the attendees. I guess if there are no more questions, we might be wrapping up earlier than expected. We're supposed to end at 5.
Yeah, we left the 30-minute chunk for Q&A. We've kind of sailed through it.
Right. Let's see. Let me just double check again. Yeah. All right. I guess we'll just wait for another minute by 4:35. If there's still nothing, what do you say? We'll just end early.
Yeah, my kids won't have a problem with that.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you again, Michael, for sharing your research, and thanks to you and your team for doing this. Appreciate for sharing your expertise and your research results and insights. Thank you to our attendees again. And thanks to our sponsors. And I'm trying to use a term because I used Maptastic Day earlier. Okay, have a rasterific day. You have a
Oh, there you go.
rasterific
That's nice.
presentation. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the afternoon.
Thank you. Y'all have a good day.
All right. Bye.